They called him the Beast of Ironridge, a warlord who bathed in the blood of his enemies. My father sold me to him for a chest of gold and a treaty. I expected to be his next meal. I never expected to become his only obsession. This is my story. The year was 1442, and the winter had come early to Oakhaven. Frost clung to the stone walls of my father's keep, a biting reminder of the barren harvest and the empty coffers. I was Rosalind Ashford, the overlooked middle daughter of Lord Arthur Ashford, while my elder sister Catherine was groomed for a royal marriage. With her spun gold hair and porcelain skin, I was the pragmatic shadow. I balanced the ledgers. I knew exactly how deep my father's gambling and warring had plunged us into ruin. But I did not know the true identity of his greatest creditor until the night the heavy oak doors of our great hall shattered under the force of a single blow. The storm outside raged, but it was nothing compared to the silence that suffocated the hall as the Ironridge men stepped through the splintered threshold. They did not walk like normal men. They stalked their movements predatory and fluid, cloaked in heavy pelts of bear and dire wolf. At their center was Gideon Vane, Lord of the Northern Wastes, the Bloodthirsty Alpha King. Whispers of the northern lichens were a staple of terrifying fireside tales. They were men afflicted by a demonic curse, shapeshifters who tore through battalions on the battlefield and feasted on the flesh of the vanquished. Gideon was their reigning monarch, a man who had supposedly slaughtered his own sire to claim the crown. Standing in our hall, water dripping from his broad-armored shoulders, he looked every bit the monster of legend. He was toweringly tall, his jaw shadowed by dark, coarse stubble, and a jagged scar cut a violent path through his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in my veins. They were a striking, luminescent amber, the eyes of a wolf. Arthur. Gideon's voice was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate the very stones of the floor. The deadline has passed. I have come for my due. 50,000 silver pieces, or I take Oakhaven and leave no breathing soul within its walls. My father, a man who usually commanded a room with boisterous arrogance, shrank back into his high-backed chair. He was trembling. My Lord Vane, the harvest, the southern blockades. I do not have the silver. A chorus of low growls erupted from the men behind Gideon. One of his lieutenants, a massive brute named Cedric, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a broadsword the size of a grown man. Gideon merely raised a single-gloved hand, and the hall went dead silent again. "Then I will take payment in flesh." Gideon stated his gaze, sweeping the room. My father eagerly pushed my sister forward. Catherine sopped her delicate hands, covering her face. "My eldest daughter, Catherine." My father stammered, his voice reeking of cowardice. "A pure maiden. She will bear you strong heirs. Take her as your bride. Forgive the debt." I felt sick. My father was trading his prized possession to a monster to save his own neck. I watched as Gideon took a slow, deliberate step toward Catherine. He leaned in, towering over her trembling form. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, taking in her scent. Then he recoiled, his lip curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. "She reeks of fear and lavender," Gideon growled. "I have no use for a fragile bird who will shatter the first time my wolf howls." My father gasped, color draining from his face. "But she is the most beautiful woman in the cow." "Quiet," Gideon snapped. His golden eyes snapped open, and his head turned sharply, locking directly onto the dark corner where I was hiding behind a stone pillar. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't moved. I hadn't made a sound. Yet his gaze pierced through the shadows, pinning me in place. Slowly, deliberately, Gideon Vane bypassed the weeping beauty of my sister and stalked toward me. With every step he took, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, yet my skin burned under the intensity of his stare. He stopped mere inches from me. Up close, the sheer size of him was suffocating. I forced myself to look up into his amber eyes, refusing to let him see the terror that was thrashing against my ribs. I clenched my fists at my sides, my nails biting into my palms to keep them from shaking. He leaned down, his face hovering just beside my neck. I felt the heat of his breath against my collarbone. He inhaled a deep, slow drag of air that made my stomach knot. "Blood and iron," he murmured, his voice suddenly dropping an octave, losing its harsh edge and taking on a rough, velvety texture. "Rainwater and fire." He pulled back and looked down at me. For a fleeting second the monster vanished, replaced by something profoundly ancient and deeply hungry. "What is your name?" he demanded. "Rosalind." I managed to say, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. Gideon turned his massive head toward my father, never taking his eyes off me. "The debt is settled, Arthur. I am taking Rosalind." "But she is plain," my father blurted out, a fool to his last breath. "She is my second." Gideon crossed the room in a blur of unnatural speed. Before my father could finish his sentence, Gideon had him pinned against the stone wall, his large, gauntleted hand wrapped securely around my father's throat. My father choked his feet, dangling inches off the floor. "Speak of my mate with disrespect again, and I will tear your tongue from your skull." Gideon snarled the sound, echoing with a dual overlapping voice that sounded distinctly unhuman. He dropped my father to the ground, where the Lord of Oakhaven lay, gasping and coughing. Gideon turned back to me. "Pack your things, Rosalind. We leave at dawn." The journey north was a brutal descent into winter. We rode for 4 days through relentless sleet and unforgiving terrain. The Iron Ridge retinue did not stop for comfort, nor did they seem bothered by the freezing temperatures. They were men of the mountains, their bodies running on an unnatural internal furnace. I rode on a dark mare near the center of the column, wearing the thickest wool cloak I owned, yet I was shivering so violently my teeth rattled. I was entirely ignored by the guards, treated as little more than cargo. That is until the second night. We had made camp in a jagged ravine to avoid the brunt of a blizzard. I sat huddled near a meager fire, my lips blue, silently cursing my father for selling me and cursing Gideon Vane for buying me. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over me. Gideon. He had barely spoken a word to me since we left Oakhaven. He stared down at me, his face an unreadable mask of hardened angles and scars. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy, fur-lined mantle from his own shoulders and dropped it over me. It was impossibly heavy, smelling of pine needles, leather, and a deep, musky scent that was uniquely his. The residual heat from his body clung to the fur, instantly warming me. "I need you alive," he said gruffly, turning his back before I could utter a word of thanks. It wasn't kindness, I told myself. It was the preservation of his property. When we finally breached the mountain pass, the ancestral home of the Blood Moon Pack loomed before us. Iron Ridge Keep was a fortress of black volcanic glass and dark stone carved directly into the side of a towering, snow-capped peak. It was terrifyingly beautiful, a jagged scar against the pale sky. Entering the castle courtyard, I was met with a culture shock that left me breathless. This was not a civilized court. There were no courtiers in silk doublets. The courtyard was teeming with people, men, women, and children, all clad in leather and furs, their eyes sharp, their movements erratic. I saw 2 men brawling near the stables, their nails elongating into claws, their teeth bearing vicious fangs as they fought for dominance over a scrap of fresh meat. No one stopped them. When I was escorted inside, I expected to be thrown into a dungeon or locked in a cold tower. Instead, Cedric the massive beta led me to a set of sprawling chambers in the east wing. A roaring fire was already lit in the massive hearth, and the bed was draped in thick velvet and furs. "The Alpha commands you rest," Cedric grunted, refusing to meet my eyes before he shut the heavy wooden door, the distinct sound of a lock tumbling into place, echoing in the empty room. I was a prisoner in a golden cage. For 2 days I didn't see Gideon. My meals were brought by a timid servant girl who fled before I could ask her a single question. The isolation was maddening, but it was abruptly shattered on the 3rd morning by the sound of my door being unlocked. It was not Gideon. It was a woman. She was strikingly wild with fiery red hair, braided tightly against her scalp, and eyes the color of cold steel. She wore fitted leather armor and carried a dagger strapped to her thigh. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, looking me up and down with open contempt. "So you are the new human plaything," she sneered, stepping further into the room. "I am Isolde. I am the lead huntress of this pack, and I thought I should introduce myself before you inevitably end up dead." I stood my ground, lifting my chin. "I was brought here to be Lord Vane's bride." Isolde threw her head back and laughed, a sharp barking sound. "A bride? Is that what the monster told you? Gideon Vane doesn't take brides, little human. He takes vessels. The Lycan curse runs so fiercely in his blood that it drives his inner wolf to madness. The only thing that calms him is human blood." She began to circle me like a predator, assessing a wounded fawn. "There have been 3 before you. Beautiful, strong girls. The longest lasted a month before his wolf took control during the full moon and tore her to pieces. You are small, frail. I give you 3 days." My heart hammered against my ribs, panic rising in my throat. Everything she said aligned with the horrifying stories of the northern wastes. I backed away, bumping into the edge of a heavy oak table. Isolde lunged forward, grabbing my jaw with a vice-like grip. Her nails bit into my skin, elongating slightly, threatening to draw blood. "He is an alpha," she hissed. "He needs a Lycan female by his side. When he is done playing with his fragile little human toy and snaps your neck, I will be the one standing beside his throne. Take your hands off her." The voice didn't come from a man. It came from a monster. The heavy wooden door had been ripped entirely off its iron hinges, splintering into pieces across the stone floor. Gideon stood in the doorway, and he was transforming. His eyes were no longer amber. They were glowing with a terrifying, bloody crimson light. The muscles in his back and shoulders were bulging, tearing the seams of his tunic. His jaw had elongated, and thick, razor-sharp fangs protruded from his lips. A low, vibrating growl emanated from deep within his chest, a sound so primal and deafening that it caused the glass panes of the windows to rattle. Isolde dropped her hand from my face, instantly, her arrogance shattering. She fell to her knees, exposing her neck in total submission, her body trembling violently. "Alpha, I was merely—" Gideon crossed the room in a fraction of a second. He did not use words. He grabbed Isolde by the collar of her armor and hurled her across the room with such horrifying force that she crashed through a heavy wooden partition, lying crumpled and groaning on the floor. Gideon didn't look at her again. He turned to me. His chest heaved, his claws fully extended, his crimson eyes burning into mine. The beast was fully at the surface, wild and untamed. According to every legend, this was the moment he would strike. This was the moment I would die. But he didn't attack. Instead, The terrifying, bloodthirsty king dropped to his knees before me. The sheer size of him still made him intimidating, but the posture was one of absolute yielding. He reached out with a massive clawed hand, his movements surprisingly slow, agonizingly gentle, and lightly brushed his thumb over the red marks Isolde's nails had left on my jaw. His crimson eyes faded back to a warm, glowing amber. He leaned forward and pressed his face against my stomach, burying his nose into the fabric of my dress, inhaling deeply. Mine. He rumbled the word, a desperate, possessive vow. No one touches what is mine. I stood frozen, staring down at the most dangerous warlord in the realm, kneeling at my feet like a devoted hound. I realized then that my father hadn't sold me to a monster looking for a meal. He had sold me to a king who had been starving for something entirely different. The days that followed the incident with Isolde were a revelation. The terrifying Alpha King of Ironridge didn't lock me away, nor did he treat me as a conquest. Instead, Gideon Vane laid his entire terrifying world at my feet. I learned that the legends of his bloodthirst were half-truths, spun to keep enemy armies at bay. The real danger lay within his own bloodline. The royal Lycans of the north were burdened with the crimson thirst, a curse inherited from Gideon's tyrannical father, King Valerius. During the peak of the full moon, the beast would consume the man, entirely driving the Alpha into a state of mindless, agonizing slaughter. Gideon had killed his father, not for power, but to stop a massacre. Now he bore the crown and the curse alone. "Until you," Gideon murmured one evening. We were standing on the high balcony of the western tower, the icy wind whipping around us. He stood close behind me, his massive frame shielding me from the bitter cold, his thick fur mantle wrapped tightly around my shoulders. "Me?" I asked, looking up at him. "I am just a human. You are my anchor," he replied, his voice a low, rough rumble. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply, a shudder tearing through his powerful chest. For centuries our seers whispered of mates whose scents could chain the beast. I thought it was a myth. But your scent, it is grounded, unbreakable. When I breathe you in, the madness quiets. You are the only silence I have ever known in my mind, Rosalind. But our newfound peace was a fragile glass about to shatter. The pack was not solely comprised of loyal warriors like Cedric. There were ambitious elders who thrived on the old brutal ways, chief among them, Lord Donovan Gallagher. Donovan was a cunning silver-haired Lycan who had served Gideon's father. He viewed Gideon's restraint and his sudden devotion to a human woman as a fatal weakness. I caught the dark, calculating sneers Donovan cast my way in the great hall. I noticed how he huddled in hushed conversations with a deeply bruised yet vengeful Isolde in the courtyard shadows. The true test arrived on the eve of the blood moon. It was the most dangerous night of the decade for the northern Lycans. The castle went into lockdown. The women and children were secured in the high keeps, while the strongest warriors patrolled the perimeters. Gideon, recognizing the unparalleled strength of the blood moon's pull, refused to risk my safety. "Lock the doors," Gideon commanded Cedric, standing at the entrance of the subterranean undercroft. His eyes were already flashing crimson, his skin feverish, the bones in his hands cracking as his body fought the agonizing transformation. He looked at me, his gaze entirely desperate. "Do not come down here, Rosalind, no matter what you hear. Promise me." "I promise." I lied, my voice trembling as I pressed my hand against his burning cheek. He was bound in thick chains, forged from meteoric iron, anchored deep into the bedrock of the castle. Once he was secured, Cedric escorted me to the highest chamber of the keep, locking the heavy iron-reinforced door from the outside. For hours, the screams echoing from the depths of the castle were unbearable. It sounded as though Gideon was being torn apart from the inside out. I paced the floor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Just past midnight, the agonizing roars abruptly shifted into deep, enraged snarls, followed by the distinct sound of clashing steel. Something was wrong. The beast was chained. There should be no fighting in the Undercroft. I rushed to the window and looked down at the courtyard. The guards posted at the Undercroft entrance were missing. In their place were the heavy-booted footprints of a dozen men leading straight down into the darkness. Panic surged through me. I didn't have time to call for Cedric. I ran to the fireplace, grabbing a heavy silver-tipped iron poker, and threw my weight against the chamber door. It was locked tight. Desperate, I grabbed a heavy stone bust from a nearby pedestal and smashed it against the wooden paneling housing the lock. My hands bled splinters driving into my skin, but on the third strike, the wood splintered, and the iron latch gave way. I tore through the dark, winding corridors of Ironridge, my velvet slippers silent on the freezing stone. When I finally reached the entrance of the Undercroft, the smell of copper and treason hung heavy in the air. 2 of Gideon's loyal guards lay dead on the steps, their throats slashed. This wasn't the work of a mindless wolf. This was an assassination. I crept down the spiraling stone stairs, holding my breath as I peered into the cavernous dungeon. The sight before me made my blood run cold. Gideon was fully transformed. He was a colossal, terrifying beast of midnight fur and razor-sharp bone, thrashing violently against the meteoric iron chains that pinned his arms and neck to the wall. He was foaming at the mouth, blinded by the blood moon's madness. Standing safely out of his reach were Lord Donovan Gallagher and a band of rogue mercenaries. Beside Donovan stood Isolde, holding a massive silver-forged halberd. "Look at him," Donovan sneered, spitting on the stone floor. "A pathetic, chained dog. The Alpha King reduced to a whimpering pet by a human whore. Kill him, Isolde. We will tell the pack the blood moon tore his heart out, and I will take the throne by dawn." Isolde stepped forward, a wicked smile twisting her face as she hoisted the silver halberd. Gideon roared, straining against the chain so fiercely that the bedrock groaned, but the iron held. He was trapped. He was going to die. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the odds of a human girl surviving a room full of heavily armed Lycan traitors. The pragmatic, quiet shadow of the Ashford family died on those stairs, and the Luna of Ironridge took her place. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice tearing through the damp cavern. Every head snapped toward me. Donovan's eyes widened in shock before narrowing into a cruel, triumphant slit. Isolde laughed aloud, lowering the halberd slightly. "Well, well," Isolde purred, stepping away from Gideon and turning her predatory gaze on me. The little human pet came to watch her master bleed. How poetic. "Kill her too," Donovan commanded, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Throw her corpse to the beast before we end him." Isolde lunged. She moved with supernatural speed, her dagger flashing in the dim torchlight. But I was not a fragile, helpless bird. I was a survivor of my father's brutal court. I ducked beneath her wild swing, bringing the heavy iron poker up with every ounce of strength I possessed. The silver-tipped iron struck Isolde squarely in the jaw. She shrieked the silver, burning her skin upon impact, and she stumbled backward. But I was too slow to dodge the mercenary beside her. He slashed his short sword, the blade slicing deep across my upper arm. Pain exploded in my shoulder, and hot crimson blood spilled down my sleeve, dripping onto the cold stone floor. The moment my blood hit the air, the entire cavern froze. The metallic, fiery scent of my blood flooded the room. I looked toward the wall, bracing myself for Gideon's final descent into feral madness. Every lichen legend dictated that the scent of fresh human blood would push a bloodthirsty alpha past the point of no return. But the opposite happened. Gideon's frenzied thrashing stopped. His massive wolfish head snapped up his glowing red eyes, locking onto my bleeding arm. The feral, unthinking rage in his gaze fractured, replaced by a profound, piercing clarity. The Blood Moon's curse was demanding he kill, but his soul, tethered to my very scent, demanded he protect. A low, vibrating rumble began deep within his chest, shaking the dust from the ceiling. It wasn't the sound of a beast losing control. It was the sound of a king reclaiming it. Gideon braced his massive legs against the stone wall. The muscles in his arms and chest bulged grotesquely, the veins thick like ropes under his dark fur. "Impossible," Donovan whispered, backing away, his face draining of color. "The chains are meteoric iron. He cannot—" With a deafening roar that shattered the glass of the lanterns Gideon pulled. The ancient bedrock cracked spider webbing across the wall, and with a horrific screech of yielding metal, the iron bolts ripped free from the stone. Gideon was loose. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The rogue mercenaries turned to flee, but Gideon was a shadow of death. He tore through them in seconds, discarding their bodies like broken dolls. Donovan tried to shift into his wolf form, but Gideon's massive claw wrapped around his throat, lifting the treacherous elder off the ground before snapping his neck with a brutal, sickening crunch. Isolde was the last one standing cornered against the iron bars of a cell, trembling so violently she dropped her halberd. Gideon stalked toward her, towering on his hind legs, a nightmare of fangs and blood. "Gideon, no!" I shouted, clutching my bleeding arm. He stopped instantly. The massive beast turned his head, his chest heaving. Slowly, the terrifying, monstrous form began to shrink, the fur receding, the bones snapping back into place, until Gideon stood before me in his human form, completely bare and covered in the blood of his enemies. He didn't care about his nakedness. He didn't care about the dead traitors. He rushed to me, dropping to his knees, his hands hovering over my bleeding arm as if terrified he might hurt me worse. "You are hurt," he choked out, his amber eyes wide with agony. "Because of me, I told you to stay away." "If I had stayed away, you would be dead," I replied softly, reaching out with my good hand to cup his cheek. His skin was scorching hot, but the feral tension was completely gone. He leaned into my palm, letting out a ragged, shuddering breath. "My bloodlust is gone," he whispered in sheer disbelief. "The moon, it has no hold on me anymore. The moment I smelled your blood, the curse broke." "You broke it, Rosalind." Within minutes, Cedric and the loyal guard, having discovered the breached doors, flooded into the undercroft. They stopped dead in their tracks, taking in the carnage, the dead elder and their Alpha King, kneeling before a bleeding human woman. Gideon stood up, towering over his men. He wrapped a discarded cloak around his waist, and then gently lifted me into his arms, holding me tightly against his broad, warm chest. He looked at Cedric, then at the assembled pack members who had gathered on the stairs, their eyes wide with awe. "Lord Donovan plotted treason with rogues!" Gideon's voice boomed with absolute authority, echoing through the cavern. "He sought to use the Blood Moon to steal the crown. But the moon no longer rules me." Gideon looked down at me, a fiercely tender smile breaking through his hardened, scarred features. "Bow to your Luna," Gideon commanded the pack. "Rosalind of House Ashford is no mere bride. She is the anchor of Ironridge, the conqueror of the Crimson Thirst, and the one true queen of the Northern Wastes." One by one, starting with the massive Beta Cedric, The fearsome lichens of the north dropped to their knees. The stone undercroft echoed with the sound of their absolute submission. My father had sold me to pay a debt, thinking he was throwing a useless daughter to a monster. He didn't know he was sending me to a kingdom that was waiting for a queen. And as Gideon carried me out of the darkness and into the first light of dawn, I knew I would never be a shadow again. Did Rosalind and Gideon's fierce love story capture your heart? If you enjoyed this thrilling tale of betrayal, passion, and a love that conquers the darkest of curses, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers to help our channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our epic weekly stories. What should we write next? Comment down below.